A single spark could erase an entire town from the map. For medieval communities, fire was a predator that stalked their crowded, wooden streets. This is the story of how they fought back against the flames with ingenuity and sheer desperation. By the end, you will understand the surprising tactics and tools that define this ancient struggle for survival. We will uncover why their towns burned so easily and reveal the desperate measures taken when water ran out. How do you think a society without modern science would confront a force of pure destruction? Walking through a medieval town was like moving through a landscape built of kindling. The very bones of these places were made to burn. Houses leaned toward each other across impossibly narrow lanes, their upper floors nearly touching, creating dark tunnels that would act like chimneys for any fire. Their frames were heavy timber, and the walls between were often just wattle and daub, a mix of woven sticks and clay that offered little real resistance to heat. But the true danger hung overhead. Thatch made from dried reeds or straw crowned almost every building. It was cheap, it was readily available, and it was terrifyingly flammable. A dry, brittle carpet just waiting for a single ember to settle into its depths. Inside these structures, life was lived in a constant, intimate dance with open flame. There was no central heating, no electric light. A cooking fire smoldered in a central hearth, its smoke curling up to blacken the roof beams. Candles and oil lamps provided a fragile, flickering light after sunset. Blacksmiths, bakers, and candle makers all plied their trades with forges and ovens that threw sparks into the air. This was a world of wood and flame, existing in a precarious balance. The town itself was a tinderbox, and the people within it carried the matches. A tipped-over candle, a wind-blown spark from a forge, or a pot of boiling fat left unattended could, in moments, become an unstoppable force. The conditions were a perfect storm, where architecture, necessity, and danger were woven together into the very fabric of daily life. Into this world of perpetual tinder walked the night watch, the community's first and most crucial line of defense. These men were the town's eyes and ears after dark, patrolling the labyrinthine streets with a lantern in one hand and a fearsome halberd in the other. Their primary weapon, however, was not the blade but their own senses. They moved through the silent, sleeping town not just looking for thieves, but listening. They trained their ears to pick out the distinctive crackle of a fire taking hold from the ordinary night sounds, their noses alert for the first sharp scent of smoke where it did not belong. When they found danger, their voices became the alarm, shouting to rouse the households and summon the town to action. Their duties extended far beyond mere detection. They were enforcers of a nightly ritual of fire safety, ensuring that all hearth fires were properly banked and covered for the night. They had the authority to reprimand anyone foolish enough to work by candlelight too close to flammable materials, a common cause of disaster. In an age before sirens or telephones, this human network of vigilance was the thin, fragile barrier between a quiet night and a town-consuming inferno. The entire community's safety rested on their weary shoulders and their ability to spot a single, errant spark in the overwhelming darkness. The night watch's cry of alarm would shatter the town's sleep, but it was the church bell that gave the sound its terrible shape. A single, frantic peal would break the quiet, quickly joined by others until the air itself seemed to vibrate with a chaotic, metallic scream. This was not the measured call to prayer, but a desperate, pounding rhythm that signaled pure emergency. From other quarters, the deep blare of a horn would join the chorus, a raw, ancient sound cutting through the din. And weaving through it all were the human voices, the endless, echoing shouts of one simple, terrifying word. Fire. This symphony of panic was the town's only siren, a sound that triggered a deep, instinctual response in every citizen who heard it. There was no time for hesitation. Doors flew open as people spilled into the streets, not as a confused mob, but as a community shifting instantly into a well-rehearsed formation. Each household was required by law to keep a leather fire bucket ready, and now these buckets were snatched up as men, women, and even older children ran toward the sound, not away from it. They fell into lines stretching from the nearest well, pond, or river to the heart of the blaze, a living, breathing chain known as the bucket brigade. The system was brutally simple, a relay race against oblivion. Full buckets of water passed hand over hand along one line toward the fire, while the empty ones traveled back along another to be refilled. It was exhausting, muscle-burning work, a direct physical struggle against the heat, with each person a single, vital link in the chain of survival. Their only tools were buckets and their own collective will, a human dam trying to hold back a river of flame. Yet for all its speed and spirit, the bucket brigade was a heartbreakingly inefficient defense. The sheer physics of it were stacked against them. A single leather bucket might hold only a few gallons of water, a pitifully small amount to throw at a roaring wall of flame. By the time that water traveled from a distant river, passed through dozens of pairs of hands, and finally reached the front lines, it was often too little and far too late. The heat at the head of the fire was so intense that water would sometimes flash into steam before it even touched the burning timbers, vanishing into the air with a useless hiss. The people at the very front of the line faced unimaginable danger, their faces blistering from the heat, their lungs searing with every breath of superheated air and smoke. They were the most vulnerable and often the first to falter or fall. This was a battle of attrition, fought with the most basic tools imaginable. The true fuel of the brigade was not the water, but the endurance of the people themselves. It was human muscle and collective will pitted against an elemental force, a desperate gamble that enough hands and enough buckets could somehow outlast the fire's appetite. The entire system was a testament to a harsh reality, that in a world without advanced technology, a community's greatest asset was its own people, willing to stand together in the face of annihilation. So what happened when the buckets were not enough, when the flames simply laughed at their efforts, when the bucket brigades scrambled into action? Their success depended entirely on one thing: proximity to water. A town could have 1,000 willing hands, but without a reliable source nearby, those hands were powerless. This is why medieval communities invested heavily in a hidden network of water infrastructure, the silent partner in every firefight. Public wells were not just convenient places to draw drinking water. They were strategic defensive points, often protected by town laws that forbade contaminating them or blocking access. These stone-lined shafts, sunk deep into the earth, were lifelines. In many towns, major wells were placed at central crossroads or market squares, ensuring they were never too far from any potential blaze. But wells could be slow to draw from, and in a true emergency, every second counted. This led to the development of more sophisticated systems in larger towns, wooden or lead conduits that channeled water from springs or rivers into public cisterns or conduits placed throughout the settlement. These were the medieval equivalent of fire hydrants, central reserves of water held in readiness. Perhaps the most crucial innovation, however, was the communal fire barrel. Towns would mandate that certain households or guilds maintain large barrels, constantly filled with water and often covered with a lid to keep it clean. These barrels were strategically positioned on key street corners, their sole purpose to be there when the alarm bell rang. They provided the first, vital dump of water directly onto a new fire, a critical head start that could snuff out a small blaze before it ever became an inferno. The geography of water was the geography of survival. A fire that started near a well or a full fire barrel had a fighting chance. One that ignited in a dry, distant alley, however, was often a death sentence for that entire quarter of the town. But water was not the only weapon in their limited arsenal. When wells ran dry or the heat proved too intense for water to be effective, townspeople turned to a range of more desperate, and sometimes startling, alternatives. The most common of these was the simple act of smothering. Men would rush forward with shovels, hurling sand and dry earth directly onto the base of the flames. This was a battle of suffocation, not cooling, as the thick layer of dirt cut off the fire's vital supply of air. It was a dirty, choking business, but it could be remarkably effective for containing smaller, ground-level blazes. For fires that climbed walls or threatened to spread across rooftops, a different tactic emerged. Soaked animal hides and heavy wool blankets, drenched in whatever water was available, became crucial tools. Teams would heave these wet, heavy coverings onto burning surfaces, again aiming to starve the fire of oxygen. The sizzling steam and the smell of scorched wool and leather filled the air, a testament to a brutal, hands-on fight for every inch of a building. In the most extreme circumstances, when every second counted and resources were gone, people resorted to even more unusual methods. Some swore by the power of vinegar, believing its acidic nature could somehow break the fire's spirit more effectively than water. In the ultimate act of desperation, there are accounts of entire brigades using their own urine, the only liquid instantly available to them, in a final, futile attempt to save their homes. Meanwhile, other crews worked at the edges of the conflagration with long, hooked poles, frantically tearing down the burning thatch from roofs. This was a strategic sacrifice, a deliberate act of destruction meant to rob the advancing fire of its primary fuel and create a gap it could not leap across. Each of these methods reveals a stark truth, that when faced with annihilation, no idea was too strange and no action too humble in the struggle to survive. Sometimes the most effective way to fight a fire was to destroy something first. When water and smothering failed, towns turned to their most drastic and deliberate tactic, controlled demolition. Teams of men, often called hookmen, would rush forward armed with long, heavy poles tipped with iron hooks. Their job was not to save the burning structure, but to tear it down as quickly as possible. They would dig these hooks into the smoldering thatch of a roof or the wooden beams of a wall, and with a coordinated heave, they would pull, straining to bring the building crashing down upon itself. The goal was to create a barren gap, a fire break stripped of all fuel, hoping the advancing flames would find nothing left to consume and simply burn themselves out. This was a grim and calculated sacrifice. The decision to destroy a home or a shop was not taken lightly. Town leaders or the fire wardens on the scene had to make a heart-breaking calculation in mere moments. They had to choose to sacrifice one or two properties, often ones already doomed, in a desperate bid to save an entire block or even the whole town from the same fate. The hookmen themselves performed one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire firefight. They worked on the very edge of the inferno, where the heat could blister skin and the air was thick with toxic smoke. A sudden shift in the wind or an unexpected collapse could easily trap them, making their mission a deadly gamble. They were the architects of a necessary destruction, their brutal work a final, stark testament to a community's will to survive at any cost. The brutal work of the hookmen was aided by their tools, specialized implements designed for one grim purpose: demolition. The fire hook was a simple but devastatingly effective device, a long wooden pole, sometimes as tall as 2 men, capped with a heavy, curved iron hook. It functioned as a lever and a claw, allowing a team to work from a slightly safer distance, digging the metal point into wooden beams or roof thatch and pulling with their combined weight to bring a structure down. This was not a delicate operation. It was a coordinated assault on a building's own skeleton, using physics as a weapon against the spreading flames. But while hooks were tools of destruction, another invention sought to improve creation: the means of delivering water. Enter the fire squirt, a device that represented a quantum leap in thinking. Imagine a giant, heavy syringe made of wood or bronze. It had a narrow nozzle at one end and a piston at the other. To operate it, the nozzle was plunged into a water source, and the piston was pulled back, sucking the liquid into the chamber. Then, a team of 2 or 3 men would heave the heavy device toward the fire, point the nozzle, and slam the piston forward with all their might. The result was a single, concentrated stream of water that could travel farther than a tossed bucket ever could. For the first time, it allowed firefighters to attack a blaze from a greater, somewhat safer distance, aiming the jet at the base of the flames. Yet this early technology had severe limits. Its range was still modest, perhaps only 20 or 30 feet, and its reservoir held only a few gallons, requiring a slow and laborious reloading process after every single shot. Against a roaring inferno, its effect was like spitting on a bonfire. But its true importance was not in its power, it was in its principle. The fire squirt was not a bucket or a hook repurposed from another task. It was one of the very first pieces of equipment designed and built solely for the mission of fighting fire. It was a physical promise, a declaration that humanity would not forever rely on buckets alone, that the mind could craft new weapons in the ancient war against the flames. But these desperate fights against active flames were only one side of the struggle. The true battle for survival began long before the first spark ever flew, etched into the very laws that governed how a town was built. Communities quickly learned that reaction was not enough. They had to build differently to live more safely. This led to the birth of medieval building regulations, a slow, often painful evolution of fire prevention. After a devastating fire would wipe out a city block, town councils would pass new ordinances aimed at preventing a repeat of the disaster. One of the most common laws concerned the walls that separated buildings, known as party walls. Initially, these were often just flimsy partitions of wattle and daub. New regulations demanded they be built thicker, sometimes even requiring them to be made of stone, rising higher than the roofline to act as a barrier against spreading flames. The most obvious danger, thatch, also came under scrutiny. Some towns did not ban it outright, as it was the only affordable roofing for most, but they imposed strict rules on its application. Laws might dictate a minimum thickness for the reed bundles, believing a denser, more compact roof would be harder to ignite. Others required that the thatch be plastered over with a layer of clay or lime wash, a crude form of fireproofing that could, in theory, resist floating embers. Perhaps the most significant change was the slow, grudging war on the wooden chimney. For centuries, the flues that channeled smoke from hearths were often just hollowed-out tree trunks packed with clay, a literal fire waiting to happen inside the home. As the centuries passed, more and more towns enacted laws banning these wooden hoods, forcing homeowners to rebuild their chimneys from brick or stone. Yet enforcement was a constant, frustrating challenge. A poor family could not simply afford to tear down their roof and replace their chimney because a new law demanded it. Compliance was slow, uneven, and often only seriously pursued in the wealthier quarters of town. These regulations represent a profound shift in thinking, a move from pure desperation to cautious foresight. It was an acknowledgement that the best way to fight a fire was to never let it start in the first place, a lesson written in the ashes of countless lost homes. The slow creep of new building codes could not protect a city from a perfect storm of disaster. In the year 1212, London learned this terrible lesson in a fire so devastating it would scar the city's memory for centuries. It began, as so many fires did, with a simple, careless spark in a neighborhood south of the River Thames. Fanned by a strong wind, the flames quickly grew into an unstoppable inferno, consuming the tightly packed wooden buildings of the borough of Southwark. But the true horror was yet to unfold. As the fire raged, a panicked crowd of Londoners fled for their lives toward the one structure that promised safety, the iconic London Bridge. At the time, the bridge was not merely a crossing. It was a vibrant, cluttered neighborhood in its own right, crammed with multi-story houses, shops, and chapels, all built from wood and thatch. It was a tunnel of kindling spanning the river. The fire, moving with terrifying speed, chased the refugees onto the bridge and trapped them there. Flames engulfed both ends of the structure simultaneously, cutting off any escape. Thousands of people, men, women, and children, were caught in the middle, with the only exits being the raging fire or the cold, swift waters of the Thames below. The death toll was catastrophic, with chroniclers of the time reporting 3,000 lives lost, a number so immense it is difficult to fully comprehend. This was not just a fire, it was a mass entrapment, a structural death trap that turned a place of safety into a funeral pyre. The shock of the 1212 fire reverberated through England. It forced a painful but crucial realization that a town's own layout could be its greatest enemy in a crisis. In its aftermath, London's leaders enacted some of the most stringent building laws the city had ever seen. King John himself issued a proclamation that specifically targeted the dangers so starkly revealed on the bridge. He decreed that all buildings on the bridge itself must have their facades plastered with daub, a direct attempt to fireproof the most dangerous thoroughfare. More broadly, the disaster accelerated the move away from thatch roofing throughout the city, pushing for more expensive but far safer clay tiles. The Great Fire of 1212 was a tragedy of unimaginable scale, but from its ashes rose a new, more urgent understanding of urban planning and safety, a legacy written in fire and water. While the entire community answered the call of the bell, the most organized and effective response often came from the town's guilds. These powerful associations of merchants and craftsmen were more than just business cartels. They were the backbone of civic order, and firefighting became one of their most critical duties. A weaver's guild, for instance, might be required by town charter to maintain a specific number of leather buckets, axes, and long fire hooks in a central guild hall, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. When an alarm sounded, the guildmaster would effectively become a fire captain, marshalling his members into a disciplined unit. Instead of joining the general chaos of the bucket brigade, these men would move with purpose, bringing their specialized tools and coordinated labor directly to the most critical points of the fire. A team of carpenters, for example, would use their expertise not to build, but to strategically demolish buildings with an efficiency the average hookman could never match. They knew how structures were put together, and therefore, they knew the best way to tear them down to create an effective firebreak. The Butcher's Guild, accustomed to handling heavy animal carcasses, might be tasked with the grueling work of manning a large fire squirt, their strength allowing them to pump the heavy piston with more force and endurance. This guild-based system introduced a new layer of strategy to the firefight. It was no longer just a frantic mob of individuals, but a coordinated effort where specific groups with specific skills and tools were assigned to specific tasks. This represented a crucial shift from pure communal reaction toward a more professionalized, organized form of fire control. The guilds brought resources, training, and a chain of command to a situation that was otherwise defined by panic, turning a desperate struggle into a somewhat more calculated battle. Above the chaotic symphony of shouts and horns, the church bell gave the disaster its voice. That frantic, metallic peal was more than just a signal. It was a command that reached into every home and every heart. The bell tower served as the town's central nervous system for emergencies, its height allowing the sound to wash over the entire settlement, cutting through the noise and confusion to summon every able-bodied person to their duty. But the church's role extended far beyond its tower. As the community scrambled into action, the local priest and his acolytes would often be a visible presence, moving among the frightened and the weary. They offered blessings and led prayers not as a replacement for the physical fight, but as a parallel effort to bolster the town's spirit. In an age where disaster was often seen as divine judgment, prayers for rain or for a shift in the wind were pleas for a miracle, an attempt to summon a force of nature to combat another. This spiritual support was a crucial part of the medieval mindset, a way to confront the feeling of helplessness in the face of such overwhelming destruction. And the church building itself provided a more tangible form of sanctuary. Constructed from stone when nearly everything else was wood, the church was often the most fire-resistant structure in town. Its thick walls and slate or tile roof offered a rare island of safety in a sea of flame. As the fire advanced, families would flee to the churchyard, dragging their most precious salvage possessions with them, chests of documents, looms, even pieces of furniture, piling them in the relative safety of the stone nave or the open yard. This grassy churchyard, clear of buildings, also acted as a natural firebreak, a pre-existing barrier of empty space that could halt the fire's progress. The church was not just a house of prayer, it was a fortress, a warehouse, and a refuge, its stone walls standing as a silent promise of permanence against the temporary fury of the flames. But the most terrifying fires were not born from accident or carelessness. They were launched with malice, from outside the very walls meant to protect the town. In the brutal calculus of medieval siege warfare, fire became a primary weapon, a tool of terror wielded with cold precision against entire communities. An attacking army, unable to breach stone walls with brute force, would instead rain destruction from the sky. Archers would loose volleys of fire arrows, their tips wrapped in oil-soaked rags and set ablaze, arching over the battlements to land on the vulnerable thatch roofs within. The goal was simple: to turn the town's own flammable nature against it, to sow panic and force a surrender through sheer, consuming horror. Against a well-prepared assault, the town's bucket brigades and fire hooks were almost useless. How could you fight a fire that fell like rain from 100 different points at once? The defenses that worked so well against a single, localized blaze were completely overwhelmed by a coordinated, military-scale attack. The very narrow streets that helped contain a domestic fire now acted as perfect channels for the spreading flames, while the crowded conditions ensured maximum devastation. In these moments, the town was not just burning, it was being systematically dismantled by an enemy who understood its every weakness. This was fire not as a natural disaster, but as a deliberate instrument of conquest, and against it, a town's civilian firefighting measures were pitifully inadequate. The sight of those glowing arrows tracing arcs against the night sky was a signal of a different kind of fight, one where the enemy was not the flame itself, but the human intelligence directing it. The terror of intentional fire cast a long and sinister shadow over every accidental blaze. In a society balanced so precariously on the edge of combustion, the crime of arson was viewed not as mere property damage, but as an attack on the soul of the community itself. It was a betrayal of the collective trust that held the town together, a deliberate act that could erase generations of work and memory in a single night. Because of this, the legal punishments were swift, severe, and designed to serve as a brutal deterrent. A convicted arsonist could expect no mercy from the courts. In many parts of Europe, the sentence was death, often by burning. The grim logic was poetic in its cruelty, a life taken by the very element the criminal had unleashed upon their neighbors. This was justice as a public spectacle, a horrific lesson meant to sear itself into the memory of every witness. But this deep-seated fear created a fertile ground for paranoia. In the frantic, smoke-choked chaos following a major fire, with rumors flying faster than the flames, the desperate need to find a cause could override reason. If no clear accidental source could be identified, the search for a scapegoat would begin. A stranger passing through town, an unpopular neighbor with a grudge, or someone simply behaving oddly in the aftermath could find themselves accused. The line between a tragic accident and a malicious plot was often drawn in the heat of the moment, guided by fear and superstition rather than evidence. This suspicion could boil over into mob violence, where a crowd, grieving their lost homes and possessions, would bypass the formal courts entirely. The accused faced a terrifying, swift, and often fatal form of street justice. This dark undercurrent reveals a painful duality in the medieval fight against fire. The same communal spirit that created the bucket brigade, the same collective will that stood against the flames, could, when twisted by fear and loss, transform into an angry mob seeking vengeance for a crime that may never have occurred. When the last embers cooled and the smoke cleared, a town faced a devastation far greater than just charred timber. The economic heart of the community had been ripped out. A master craftsman's workshop, with its specialized tools accumulated over a lifetime, was gone. A merchant's entire stock of wool or spices, their family's entire wealth tied up in a single warehouse, had vanished into ash. The homes of the laborers who powered the local economy were simply erased. This was not merely a loss of property, it was the collapse of a local economic ecosystem. Trade would stall for months or even years, as the town had nothing to sell and no means to produce it. The destruction of tax records and debt ledgers created a different kind of chaos, erasing both obligations and proof of ownership, leaving a legal and financial tangle that could take generations to resolve. So how did a community, stripped of its wealth, possibly begin the monumental task of rebuilding? The answer was a patchwork of desperation and solidarity. Town councils would often impose special taxes on the entire citizenry, a heavy burden even on those whose property had been spared, Wealthy merchants and powerful guilds were frequently called upon for charitable donations, a civic duty that also served to protect their own economic interests in a functioning town. In some cases, towns would take out massive loans from other cities or even from the church, mortgaging their future for decades to come. But within this catastrophe, there sometimes lay a seed of opportunity. The blank slate of a burned-out district allowed for a radical rethinking of the urban landscape. The very narrow, winding lanes that had acted as fire chimneys were often widened by decree during the rebuilding process. New regulations might mandate that all new buildings on a main street have stone fronts or tile roofs, even if the backs were still timber. This painful, expensive rebirth could, in the long run, create a more resilient, more modern, and even more prosperous town. The fire had taken everything, but in doing so, it forced a choice between simply recreating the same vulnerabilities or building something stronger from the ashes. This web of mutual obligation was the closest thing a medieval town had to an insurance policy. Long before the first insurance company was founded, communities understood that survival depended on sharing the burden of catastrophe. If your neighbor's house burned down, you did not just offer sympathy. You were often legally required to provide materials and labor to help them rebuild. This was not mere charity, it was a form of social contract, a recognition that the entire town's resilience was only as strong as its weakest, most vulnerable link. A family left destitute by a fire became a drain on communal resources, a potential source of crime or begging. Helping them rebuild their home and workshop was an investment in the town's own economic and social stability. This mutual aid was enforced through local bylaws and the powerful pressure of public opinion. Refusing to contribute to a neighbor's recovery could result in fines or social ostracism, marking you as a person who had broken faith with the community itself. For craftsmen and merchants, this safety net was often woven by their guilds. These organizations functioned as proto-insurance agencies for their members. A carpenter who lost his tools in a blaze, or a baker whose oven was destroyed, could appeal to his guild for support. The guild's treasury, funded by member dues, would provide a loan or an outright grant to help him get back on his feet. This system ensured that vital skills were not lost to the community, and that a master's knowledge could be passed on to the next generation. It was a pragmatic form of risk sharing, where every member contributed a little to protect any one of them from losing everything. Religious fraternities offered another layer of protection. These lay brotherhoods, dedicated to a particular saint or charitable cause, would collect alms from their members. When a brother or his family suffered a loss from fire, the fraternity would step in, providing funds for food, shelter, and even rebuilding costs. This was seen as a sacred duty, a corporeal act of mercy that fulfilled one's spiritual obligations while providing tangible, life-saving support. The line between a financial safety net and a spiritual one was blurry at best. Helping your neighbor rebuild was not just good citizenship, it was a path to divine favor. This intricate tapestry of legal duty, guild solidarity, and religious charity formed a fragile but essential shield against total ruin. It was a system built on the profound understanding that in a world of wood and flame, no one could truly fireproof their life alone. These fragile networks of mutual aid could only do so much. The fundamental problem remained the same, a desperate lack of force. A bucket, no matter how many hands passed it, could only ever deliver a splash. A fire squirt offered a single, brief jet. The real breakthrough, the moment the fight against fire truly began to evolve, came with the invention of a machine that could throw a continuous stream of water. This was the hand-pumped fire engine, a device that began to appear in European cities in the 16th century, its principles rooted in the late medieval struggle. Imagine a large, heavy tub on wheels or runners, mounted with a powerful, twin-piston pump. One team of men would frantically work long handles on either side, driving the pistons up and down. This action forced water from the tub through a leather hose and out of a fixed nozzle, creating a relentless, powerful jet. Another crew stood ready with buckets, keeping the tub constantly supplied from a nearby well or cistern. The effect was revolutionary. For the first time, a fire crew could douse a blaze with a sustained, targeted attack, hitting the base of the flames from a safer distance without the exhausting, inefficient relay of the bucket brigade. The water did not just dampen the fire, it battered it. These early engines, often painstakingly built by local craftsmen and proudly maintained by a town's guild, were crude and incredibly hard to operate. The men pumping the handles faced back-breaking labor, and the leather hoses were prone to bursting under pressure. Yet their arrival marked a profound shift. The fight was no longer just a battle of human endurance against an element. It was a contest of engineering. The hand-pumped engine was a tangible declaration that humanity was finally starting to close the technological gap, turning a desperate, communal scramble into a more calculated, mechanical operation. This was the true bridge out of the medieval era, a clattering, cumbersome, but magnificent machine that carried the hopes of a town on its wooden frame, pointing the way toward a future where fire would not always have the final say. The wealth of the Hanseatic League was literally built from kindling. Across the Baltic coast, prosperous towns like Lübeck, Riga, and Danzig rose to power on the timber trade, their very identities forged from the forests they harvested. Yet this abundance of wood, the source of their incredible fortune, was also the architect of their greatest vulnerability. These bustling ports were treasure chests of wool, furs, wax, and salt, all stored in vast, timber-framed warehouses that stood shoulder to shoulder along the waterfront. A single spark in one of these commercial districts could threaten to bankrupt not just a single merchant, but an entire economic network that stretched from London to Novgorod. The interconnected nature of this league meant a fire in one city was a crisis for all, disrupting supply chains, destroying cargoes destined for foreign markets, and crippling the financial credit that fueled their international ventures. How did a confederation of merchants, whose power relied on stability and predictability, confront an enemy as chaotic and destructive as fire? The answer lies in a remarkable agreement forged from shared disaster. In the year 1276, a catastrophic fire swept through the heart of Lübeck, the unofficial capital of the Hanseatic League. The flames consumed the original town hall, priceless documents, and entire quarters of merchant homes and storehouses. The economic shockwave reverberated across the Baltic. This was not just Lübeck's problem, it was a league-wide emergency. In the aftermath, the member towns did something unprecedented. They began to codify fire safety into their collective agreements. They shared architectural knowledge, promoting the construction of brick and stone gables on the fronts of buildings, even if the sides and backs remained timber. They exchanged information about the effectiveness of new roofing materials, like the clay tiles that were slowly replacing thatch in wealthier districts. The League became a conduit for innovation, where a firefighting technique proven effective in Riga might be formally recommended to the merchants of Tallinn. This was disaster prevention on an international scale, a pragmatic recognition that their collective wealth depended on their collective resilience. A fire in one port was a threat to every ship sailing into another, and so they pooled their hard-won knowledge, transforming individual tragedy into a shared body of defensive strategy. Their cooperation reveals a profound truth, that commerce, often seen as a cold pursuit of profit, could also be a powerful force for building a safer world, one brick and one bucket at a time. Yet the medieval mind saw fire not just as a physical threat, but as a message from heaven. In an age where every event was filtered through a lens of faith, a devastating blaze was rarely seen as mere chance. It was a judgment, a purifying punishment sent by a wrathful God to scourge a sinful community. The flames that consumed their homes and workshops were interpreted as a direct response to collective moral failure, to greed, to blasphemy, or to civic corruption. This belief was not a quiet, private thought. It was a public conviction that shaped the entire response to disaster. In the days following a great fire, the entire town would often be called to a mass penitential procession. The bishop and clergy, barefoot and robed in sackcloth, would lead a solemn parade of citizens through the smoldering ruins. They would pray for forgiveness, sing psalms of lament, and publicly flagellate themselves, their physical pain an offering to atone for the spiritual sins they believed had called down the fire. This was not just about mourning the loss. It was an active attempt to cleanse the community's soul and prevent a recurrence of divine anger. The very act of rebuilding was infused with this symbolism. When a grand church was reconstructed from the ashes of a burned-down predecessor, its new design was often a deliberate act of atonement. The new stonework might be more elaborate, the stained glass more brilliant, the altar more magnificent. This was not simply a matter of building back better. It was an architectural prayer, a physical offering meant to be more pleasing to God than the society that had stood before. The community was literally trying to build its way back into divine favor, creating a monument of stone and faith so beautiful that it might ward off the purifying flames next time. The fire was a terrifying end, but in the medieval worldview, it was also a brutal chance for a more pious, more perfect beginning. While Europe fought its desperate battle with wood and water, a different story was unfolding across the Mediterranean. In the great cities of the medieval Islamic world, from Cairo to Baghdad, the fundamental relationship between a city and fire was being redefined by architecture and engineering. The contrast is striking. Where a European town was a dense forest of timber and thatch, an Islamic city's heart was often a labyrinth of stone and brick. Sun-baked mud brick and fired clay were the primary building materials, not out of a lack of wood, but as a deliberate adaptation to a hotter, drier climate. The very bones of these cities were made of stuff that was far harder to ignite. Walk through the narrow alleys of Old Fez or Damascus, and you were surrounded by earthen walls and vaulted stone ceilings, with open courtyards at the center of homes acting as natural fire breaks. This was fire safety by design, a form of passive prevention woven into the urban fabric. But the most brilliant innovation lay not just in how they built, but in how they managed the water that was so precious to them. Beneath the streets of these arid cities ran a hidden marvel, the Qanat. These were not simple wells, but vast, hand-dug underground canals that tapped into distant mountain aquifers, using gravity to channel a constant, reliable flow of fresh water for miles. This network did more than irrigate fields and supply fountains. It created a pervasive, pressurized water supply that was inherently more resilient for fighting fires. A blaze in a dense urban quarter could be fed by water channeled directly from a Qanat into a local cistern or a public fountain, a strategic reserve that never ran dry. This stands in stark contrast to the European reliance on static, often distant wells and rain-filled barrels. The Islamic approach was holistic, viewing urban safety as a single, interconnected system of construction and hydrology. Where a European town might react to a fire with a frantic human chain, an Islamic city had, in a sense, already built a mechanical one deep within the earth. This was not necessarily a matter of one culture being more advanced than the other, but a profound lesson in how environment, resources, and ingenuity shape a society's dialogue with disaster. They fought the flames without ever truly understanding their enemy. The medieval world lacked the most fundamental concept we take for granted today, the fire triangle. They had no scientific framework for the three things a fire needs to survive: fuel, heat, and oxygen. Without this knowledge, their entire approach was based on observation and tradition, not on chemistry. They could see that fire consumed wood, so they tore down buildings to remove the fuel. They could feel its searing heat, so they threw water on it to cool it. But the invisible third element, the air that fire breathes, remained a complete mystery to them. This ignorance created a critical blind spot. When they threw a wet hide over a blaze, they were accidentally smothering it, cutting off its air supply, but they did not know why it worked so well. They were solving the puzzle without seeing the picture on the box. Their intellectual foundation was not modern science, but the ancient theory of the four elements. Fire was not a chemical reaction. It was a pure, fundamental substance itself, one of the essential building blocks of the universe alongside earth, air, and water. In this worldview, fire was not something you understood. It was something you appeased or battled. This is why their responses so often blended the practical with the spiritual, why prayers for rain held as much weight as a leather bucket. They were fighting a primal force on its own terms, using methods honed by tragic experience but devoid of deeper insight. They knew that water often put fire out, but they could not explain that it worked by both cooling the fuel and displacing the oxygen. They knew that tearing down a house could stop the spread, but they did not grasp they were breaking the chain of fuel. Every victory was a lucky guess, every failure a bewildering mystery. How could you hope to truly master a force when you did not even know the rules of its existence? The ghost of those medieval infernos is permanently etched into the stone and street plans of our oldest cities. Walk through the historic core of any major European town, and you are traversing a landscape shaped by fire. That unusually wide main street, now lined with charming cafes, was likely carved out by hookmen in desperation after a catastrophic blaze. It was not designed for beauty or traffic, but as a deliberate fire break, a permanent gash in the urban fabric meant to halt the next great fire in its tracks. The authorities, rebuilding from ashes, seized the opportunity to impose order on chaos, mandating that these new thoroughfares be broad enough to prevent flames from leaping from one side to the other. The very arteries of the city were redesigned as defensive moats against an invisible enemy. Look up at the rooftops. The sea of red clay tiles that defines the silhouette of so many ancient towns is another direct legacy. This was the slow, expensive victory of regulation over tradition, a municipal decree banning flammable thatch once and for all, forcing the adoption of a material that could resist floating embers. Even the placement of a modern fire station in a seemingly odd location can often be traced back to the site of a crucial medieval well or a guild hall that once stored the town's fire hooks and buckets. Every time we admire a cobbled square or a grand boulevard, we are seeing the aftermath of a centuries-old disaster, a scar tissue of stone that tells a silent story of survival. The medieval town fought fire with every tool it had, and when the tools failed, it rebuilt its very body to be stronger, leaving us a map of its fears and its resilience in the layout of our streets. Perhaps the most persistent myth is that medieval towns fought fires with beer. The romantic image of citizens dousing flames with precious ale makes for a good story, but it crumbles under the weight of simple logic. Water was always the first and most desperate priority, and it was far more plentiful than any brewed beverage. A town's survival depended on its access to wells, rivers, and rain barrels, not its stock of ale. Beer was a valuable commodity, a source of nourishment and taxable income. Pouring it onto a fire would have been seen as a shocking waste, like throwing gold coins into the blaze. While there are rare, isolated accounts of tavern owners using whatever liquid was at hand to save their own property, this was an act of last resort, not a standard tactic. The organized bucket brigades would have been channeling water, not ale, in a continuous, life-saving flow from the nearest source. The very idea misunderstands the economics of survival. A community would never sacrifice its drinkable, sellable resources when a free, if sometimes distant, alternative was available. Their methods were born of brutal necessity, not whimsy. Another common misconception is to view their entire effort as a primitive, disorganized mob. While the scene was certainly chaotic, it was underpinned by a sophisticated social organization that we often overlook. This was not a random collection of individuals. It was a community executing a pre-established plan. The legal requirement for each household to keep a fire buck, it was a form of civic mobilization. The guilds responding with their specialized tools and trained members represented a professionalized force within the chaos. The hookmen performing controlled demolition were following strategic decisions made by appointed leaders on the scene. This was a society leveraging its entire structure, from its laws to its labor systems, in a coordinated defense. To dismiss their efforts as entirely rudimentary is to ignore the complex web of mutual obligation, designated roles, and shared technology that define their response. Their technology, while basic by our standards, was also in a constant state of evolution for their time. The fire squirt was not a toy. It was a carefully engineered device that applied the principles of suction and pressure, a significant leap from a simple bucket. The slow, enforced transition from wooden chimneys to brick, and from thatch roofs to tile, was a monumental technological and regulatory shift that took centuries to implement. These were not static societies resigned to their fate. They were continuously adapting, experimenting, and building on hard-won experience. They were innovating within the severe limits of their materials and scientific understanding, slowly closing the gap between human vulnerability and elemental power. The story of medieval firefighting is not one of ignorance and futility, but of relentless, clever adaptation in the face of an ever-present threat. Our journey through the smoky past reveals a struggle fought with the only true weapons they had, each other and their unwavering will. The story of medieval firefighting is not a chronicle of advanced technology, but a testament to human ingenuity in the face of a relentless, elemental foe. They fought with leather buckets and human chains, with fire hooks and desperate prayers, weaving a fragile shield from community spirit, rudimentary tools, and strict, if slowly evolving, laws. Every frantic shout, every passed bucket, every torn-down roof was a declaration that they would not surrender their homes without a fight. While their methods were born of desperation and often ended in tragedy, their relentless adaptation laid the very cornerstone of modern fire safety. The bucket brigade evolved into the organized fire company. The guild's mandated tools became the standard equipment of professional crews. The painful lessons written in ashes forged the building codes and urban planning principles that protect our cities today. Their war against the flames, fought in the narrow, shadowy streets of 1,000 years ago, echoes in the siren of every fire engine that races to a call. We would love to hear if your own town has a history shaped by a great fire, a story perhaps still whispered in its oldest streets. And if you enjoyed this journey into historical mysteries, subscribe for more adventures into the forgotten corners of our past.